The Bitcoin Standard Podcast brings you seminars from Saifedean.com, my independent online learning platform where you can take my online courses on the economics of Bitcoin and economics in the Austrian school tradition, join our 2 live weekly seminars, and read my books before they are published. Sign up now for access to the draft of my forthcoming economics textbook, Principles of Economics, and take 5 full online courses based on my books, The Bitcoin Standard, The Fiat Standard, and Principles of Economics. The Bitcoin Standard Podcast is brought to you by Crowd Health. Crowd Health is the Bitcoiner's answer to fiat health insurance. If you listen to this show, you've probably heard me rail against the problems of modern healthcare and health insurance. Crowd Health is a brilliant new solution to this problem that leverages the power of Bitcoin to help people get affordable healthcare. Crowd Health holds its cash reserves in Bitcoin. It negotiates with healthcare providers on your behalf and gets you much better rates by offering to pay them cash, upfront, without having to go through the expensive bureaucracy of modern healthcare insurance. It's a solution that works better for healthcare providers and for patients by disintermediating large insurance companies who have the wrong incentives and are constantly raising costs. I'm very happy to have signed up for Crowd Health, and I'm really excited to support them as they disrupt the fiat health insurance industry. Go to joincrowdhealth.com and use the discount code SAIF, S-A-I-F, and you'll get the first 6 months for $99 only.
Coinbits. Coinbits is a great way to introduce your pre-coiner friends and family to Bitcoin. Get them set up in under a minute and help kickstart their journey by turning everyday spare change into Bitcoin. This Bitcoin-only app takes the uncertainty and fear out of Bitcoin saving by rounding up debit and credit card purchases to the nearest dollar, then using the difference to buy Bitcoin. Set it, forget it, and let the app automatically tax your high-time preference spending by saving the hardest money ever. Want to save in Bitcoin faster? Customers can multiply their roundups up to 10x or adjust their savings frequency for weekly or daily Bitcoin stacking. Coinbits is built on a sound, tried and true dollar cost averaging strategy that turns Bitcoin's volatility in your favor. Once you've gotten a private wallet set up, Coinbits encourages you to withdraw your Bitcoin to your own private wallet and embrace the Bitcoin standard way of life. Start stacking on coinbitsapp.com and save your time and energy in the soundest money ever.
Get paid in Bitcoin regardless of who you work for and regardless of who is paying you. All thanks to a premium service I personally love and use, and that is Bitwage. Thanks to Bitwage, I receive my book's royalties in Bitcoin. It is cheaper, faster, and easier. It is a true set it and forget it system, and Bitwage has been offering this premium service since 2014. Anyone can sign up and use it right away. No restrictions or limits, fully non-custodial. You can even split your incoming payment. Get part in Bitcoin and part to a bank account you specify. It could not be easier, and I cannot recommend Bitwage highly enough. Go to bitwage.com and sign up now and get paid in Bitcoin with your next payment or salary. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Bitcoin Standard Podcast. Our guest today is Sam Apple. Sam is the author of Ravenous, Otto Warburg, the Nazis, and the Search for the Cancer Diet Connection. His book, published in May 2021, explores the fascinating life story of Otto Warburg, a Nobel Prize-winning scientist who, despite being both Jewish and gay, survived Nazi Germany because of his valuable research into cellular metabolism and cancer. He joins us today for a discussion of his book and the connection between diet and cancer. Sam, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So, to begin with, could you give us a little bit of a background about the main character of your book, Otto Warburg, and his fascinating life story?
Sure. Otto Warburg was born in Germany in the late 19th century, and his father was a very well-known physicist, Emil Warburg. And so Otto Warburg grew up in a house that was filled with some of the greatest scientists in history. Einstein was a close friend of the family, Max Planck, Emil Fischer, many other luminaries of German science, Fritz Haber, were regulars in his childhood home. So he grows up in this world expecting to be a great scientist and sort of assuming that he'll win a Nobel Prize one day after the Nobel Prizes are introduced, but not sure entirely what field he wants to go into. But he eventually decides that he wants to go into biology, or to move away from the physics of his father and to look at biology through the lens of physics, through the lens of energy. And so goes on to make this remarkable discovery about cancer in 1923. So he was truly brilliant, but also uniquely arrogant. He was famous among scientists from a relatively young age for believing he was a genius and sort of telling everybody that. And he was the unusual narcissist who sort of had evidence to support his narcissism.
Yeah. And I think his work on cancer metabolism is truly fascinating and I think enormously important. He's best known for discussing the Warburg effect. What is the Warburg effect? Could you give us your kind of summary of from having studied him so extensively?
Sure. So, Warburg's most famous discovery, at least in the context of cancer, was that cancer cells seem to take up nutrients and to fuel their growth in a very unusual way, whereas most cells will take up the glucose, the blood sugar, and burn it in our mitochondria. These are, famously called the power stations of our cells, and they basically react the glucose with oxygen. Cancer cells will instead take most of that glucose, that energy from our cells, and ferment it, a process that doesn't rely on oxygen. They basically split the glucose in two and turn it into lactic acid. It's the same process that microorganisms use when, making alcohol in the case of alcoholic fermentation, or lactic acid, in the case of organisms that allow us to have yogurt and cheeses. So it was a strange thing that cancer cells were behaving in this way, because it's a very inefficient way to make energy. And cancer cells, you would think, would need more energy than other cells because they're growing. So it was a strange thing to discover. And Warburg, was trying to figure out why it happened and what it meant, and became convinced that this unusual process of eating, this fermentation, was the core to the cancer problem, and that if we could solve this problem, we'd be able to cure cancer. And it's called the Warburg effect because a cell will, and typically you would expect a cell only to turn to fermentation if there's no oxygen around, and it's sort of a backup engine. It's desperation, or maybe there's oxygen, but there's not enough oxygen to process all the fuel that's coming in. So that's actually what happens when we exercise intensely, and we're sprinting or doing intense exercise, and we can't keep up with the demand, and we start to turn to fermentation, and that process actually leads to us getting sore. But in that case, it's sort of a crisis for the cell. But cancer cells have all this oxygen, and they still prefer fermentation. So that's what the Warburg effect is. It's turning to this backup engine even when we have oxygen available.
And so, what is the significance of the Warburg effect, of this metabolism process for cancer cells? Why is that important and interesting, and why would he win a Nobel Prize for it?
Sure. Well, he deserved a Nobel Prize for it, and he almost won the Nobel Prize for it. But in the end, they gave him the Nobel Prize for a different discovery, not for this one. But it was really important because it seemed to be happening, in every cancer that Warburg studied. In the end, experts now say it's probably about 70% of cancers, but it's a very fundamental shift. Warburg thought it was the most fundamental distinction between a normal cell and a cancer cell. And when you think about, the great challenge of attacking cancer is finding out what makes a cancer cell unique, because, it's easy to kill cells. The problem is when you try to kill cancer cells, you kill all the other cells. So it looked like it might create a vulnerability. In the context of treatment, that was very exciting. But my interest ultimately, sort of progressed to the point where what I thought was most important about it is what it possibly means for cancer prevention. Is there something about the way we eat and the way we live that drives this shift to a different style of eating? Is there a relationship between our diets, the way we eat, and the way a cancer cell eats? And I think the evidence suggests that there is. And so that's ultimately the most important takeaway.
And what is that evidence, and what is the implication of it? I think listeners are not going to be surprised. They know me and they know my agenda.
Yeah. So, it's been very clear, for a long time that these cancer cells are taking up more glucose than an ordinary cell. And the question is, why they're doing that, what drives that shift. So Warburg's hypothesis, Warburg's experiments were deemed to be correct, but his hypothesis for why it happens was not always deemed to be correct. And many people think it's wrong. And I concluded that it's probably largely off target in most cancers. But Warburg thought it happened because the mitochondria, the power stations, are ultimately dysfunctional. They can't process the glucose. And so the cell shifts to this backup engine out of desperation. That may be true in some cancers and actually in some other diseases, but it seems that cancer cells can continue to function properly with respect to their mitochondria in most respects. So if they're not doing it because they have a defect in the mitochondria, why are they doing it? One hypothesis that's commonly thought about is it's just related to how much glucose in your blood. If you eat a lot of carbohydrates, there's going to be more access to carbohydrates, to the glucose for the cancer cells, and that will lead to more glucose processing and more cancer. And I think that that's an incomplete explanation as well. It's certainly part of the story, but we all have glucose running through our blood all the time. You die very quickly if you didn't. So if it was just as simple as the availability of glucose, you wouldn't think that it would make the difference. So the hypothesis that really intrigues me most is what I call the insulin hypothesis, that the central problem is that for many of these cancers, particularly obesity linked cancers, which is a list of 13 and growing, and these are often the most deadly cancers, we find is that there's a strong correlation between elevated glucose and cancer rates. And so that's just at the level of correlation. But we also find at the, at the level of the biochemistry is that these cancer cells are covered in insulin receptors, and the most common mutations are actually in these pathways that respond to insulin. So it really combines the sort of epidemiology and the biochemical understanding. And the hypothesis that I lean towards is that we eat these diets that are high in refined grains and sugar in particular, and that causes a problem of fat buildup around our internal organs and insulin resistance. Then we have this elevated insulin, and that elevated insulin 24 hours a day, 50 times the insulin of a normal healthy person. I shouldn't say normal because so many of us have this, but that elevated insulin, it seems to function much like a growth factor, giving these incipient cancer cells the signal to stay alive, the signal to grow. And, once they develop a mutation that really allows them to take advantage of that situation, they're off and running. And so I think that's really the heart of the cancer diet story.
Mm-hmm. So let me just repeat this, because I think it's a very important distinction and it's not very easy to grasp. So the Warburg effect, you argue, is directionally correct, and in terms of its conclusions it is correct, but it doesn't tell us the full story because it misses the insulin resistance part of the story, right?
I would say that that the Warburg effect as a molecular phenomenon is correct. Warburg accurately described what cancer cells do. They take up all this glucose and they ferment it. And the question, and I think most people would also agree that that's central to cancer, but the debate is about, why it happens.
And so to be clear, that idea is that they thrive on glucose input, and they thrive in their metabolism happens in an anaerobic way, right?
Right. They have oxygen. They could do it aerobically in theory, but they prefer to do it anaerobically, or they still use oxygen in many cases, but they also crank up. So there's sort of two sets of questions that relate to this. One question, which we maybe will also talk about, is why cancer cells do this. What's the advantage for the cancer cell? But in terms of preventing cancer, the question I'm most interested in is what causes the switch, and why is that happening? It could be a defect in the mitochondria and the power stations that Warburg says. It could have nothing to do with diet or lifestyle. It could just be unlucky mutations that allow a cancer cell to take advantage of glucose or insulin. I think a lot of cancer scientists today would say that, or to the extent that they think about it all, they'd say, it's just bad luck, you get a mutation. Or it could be that it's not just unlucky mutations, but something about the way we eat is actually driving the process forward, causing more glucose to come into our cells, maybe driving some of the mutations, or maybe just giving a cell that would otherwise die a chance to take advantage of this extra insulin and glucose. But I think it's very clear that something about our lifestyle is causing this. And that really isn't controversial. Almost every cancer expert, I think, agrees that a high percentage of our cancers are caused by the way we live and eat. The range is usually anywhere from 40, a lot of people say 70%, some say 90%. So that's been the mystery for really a century and a half, is what it is that's causing it, and the standard answer might be, well, it's many things. It's smoking, of course, and the environment, the sun exposure and sexually transmitted diseases and poor diet. It's, the term is often multifactorial. And that's, of course, true. But I think we've somehow, in the midst of all this complicating factors, sort of overlooked something like the big, the quote unquote elephant in the room, like this big thing that is staring at us, and that a lot of people amazingly don't know about, have never heard about, don't think of sugar as potentially carcinogenic, whereas, I think it's maybe the greatest threat of all in terms of what we can prevent.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. But just to dig more into the complexity of this question. So for Warburg, he did not believe in the kind of genetic explanations. For him, it was more environmental, what was driving this, or it was dietary? What do you think, where his...
The molecular biology and the, sort of genetic understanding of cancer was just emerging at the end of his life. He died in 1970. But he saw it coming and was dismissive of it because he thought, sort of downstream of the fundamental thing. He thought the problem clearly had to arise in the mitochondria, what he called the grana. He was a very aristocratic person. He thought of himself as an aristocrat. He thought that higher forms of life use oxygen to create their energy, and the cancer cell was reverting to this ancient metabolism as he viewed it. And it was a lower form of life. He said, one of his quotes, I'm paraphrasing, is that in the case of cancer, oxygen is dethroned, or respiration is dethroned. That's how he thought of it. So he thought something had to be going wrong. And he discovered, he won the Nobel Prize in 1931 for sort of elucidating the key step in respiration, how a cell breathes, how, glucose is broken down and the electrons are passed along to oxygen. So he thought something in that process broke down and caused cancer by forcing a cell to shift to this primitive metabolism.
And I remember in your book you mentioned that he likened cancer metabolism to sewer rats, because the sewer rats live in places where oxygen isn't very available, and so they learn to, or they have to adapt by conducting metabolism with little oxygen. And somehow cancer is like that, right?
Yeah, I had forgotten that specific line, but it does sound like Warburg. And there are actually these mole rats that live underground and don't have as much access to oxygen, and they do seem to rely on fructose as a way to fuel some of this Warburg metabolism, as I would call it. So there's some really fascinating elements here into how sugar can drive this process.
Yeah, and I think I think it's absolutely tragic, and at the same time hilarious, that scientists will, with a serious intent and with a serious look on their face, tell you that it is all genetic. When 200 years ago, cancer prevalence rates were nowhere near as high as they are now, and somehow now they explode. Everybody alive today had an ancestor who was alive 200 years ago, and yet 200 years ago, very few of our ancestors had cancer. So the genes somehow weren't working then to give us cancer. But now today, all these genes somehow decided to get activated. And I find it absurd that we would not look, even if you want to say that there is a genetic component to it, the question is, why do these genetic the mutations or whatever it is, why do they show up now and not previously? Clearly, it's something in the way that we live, in the way that we eat, in the air that we breathe. You could make any of these explanations you need to find something that's here now, but that wasn't around 200 years ago. And I think that's a very basic logic, which is, you, from my experience with education, you have to get very highly credentialed in order to start being able to confidently dismiss the obvious and to confidently assert the absurd, which is, oh, it's just your genetics, let alone the fact that 200 years ago, none of your ancestors had heard about cancer, maybe. But no, 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 it's your genetics.
Yeah. Yeah. No,
Affecting
I
them.
mean, I find it mind baffling. And I tried to anticipate the arguments and the counterpoints. I didn't really need to anticipate them. I found them in the literature. So I tried to take them on one by one. Sometimes most people just say it's genetic and just don't even really think about it. And it's confusing because these same people will say, well, yeah, of course there are environmental factors, but then they don't go any further. But if you look at the standard arguments, they'll say, well, people didn't used to live as long and that's why they didn't get cancer. So you show them all that evidence and they say, well, they didn't have the same diagnostic techniques. And then you show how even after all the diagnostic techniques came along, the cancer rate continued to grow and grow. And it's very easy to show, and it's been clear for over a century that we've had this huge growth, that started in the late 19th century in cancer. And yet, for reasons I don't fully understand, there's, many medical professionals, certainly not all, but many, just sort of have this natural aversion to this story that it's sort of unpleasant to think about, and we can't do anything about it, perhaps. So they just, throw up their hands and say, people are just living longer. But if you just spend 20 minutes doing research, you can see that can't explain it away. So the other explanation is just, well, okay, you're right, but it could be 100 different things. The way we live now is so different from the way people lived long ago. Then how can you pinpoint it to this one thing?
Yeah, so let's just throw up our hands and do radiation therapy and not try and figure out what's going on.
Yeah, I mean, it is a hard problem, because so many of these things, the best way to prove that it's sugar or high insulin would be, to do the kind of study we really can't do, which would be, a randomized controlled experiment where we gave people tons of sugar over decades. But, short of that, we just have a remarkable amount of evidence. And, the pattern's been clear for so long, and it's really not just cancer. I honestly could have written the same book in a sense about, diabetes and cardiovascular disease, but they all start trending together. And it always happens after sugar comes into the diet. When I say sugar, I mean sucrose, not glucose, but the sweet white stuff. That's always a key triggering event. And, with other refined carbs as well. And, they're really, there are really no exceptions. As soon as the Western lifestyle is adopted, these diseases start to arise. And, interestingly, a lot of these societies that were largely, cancer-free, not entirely, but largely cancer-free in the 19th century, you'd have these doctors that would come and stay with them for decades. And, when they'd arrive, they would have a really hard time finding any cases of cancer. And by the time they left and these local populations had been eating sugar for, a couple of decades, sure enough, cancers would start to arise. So you could see it in real time at the time.
You wouldn't blame these populations for blaming the doctor for the cancer. And it would definitely be more rigorous and more scientific than blaming their genetics, because the genetics were fine before the doctor showed up. But obviously the doctor showed up at the same time that the sugar showed up. I think one of my favorite books is Weston Price's Nutrition and Physical Degeneration. I don't know if you're familiar with it. And it shows exactly what you did. And I think what's really unique about that book and about Weston Price's work is that, he did this at a time. He traveled around the world at a time when airplanes were just invented. And he went to all those places that were completely isolated or very isolated before, that they didn't trade with the rest of the world. They were very far apart from modern industrial civilization. And so he arrived at the time where the airplanes could carry him there, but there were no train tracks and there were no ships that were used to bring in food to these populations. So he saw people at the beginning of the 20th century that were still insulated from all of our modern highly processed industrial foods, particularly flour and sugar, the two main culprits in his explanation. And and he would examine populations from all over the world. It would be, say, Inuits in Alaska and northern Canada, and he'd look at the population of Inuits that was close to a white settlement, so they traded with the white Europeans, and then the other population, which was a couple of hundred miles away, genetically very similar, but they were isolated. They weren't trading with the white settlers, and so they didn't eat sugar and flour. And he would go and he would examine their teeth, and he would take pictures, and he took samples of the food that they ate, and he sent them back to his laboratory in Ohio. He examined the food content, and I think that's the closest thing that we could get to a randomized controlled trial, because you were doing the same thing with Pacific Islanders, with Inuits, with Maasai in the center of Africa, basically the full diversity of humanity. He looked, in each case, he would find the population that was isolated, that was eating its traditional food that they'd been eating for centuries or millennia, versus the population that was integrated into world trade and eating modern sugar and modern flour. And in all cases, he would just find extremely stark evidence. And it's just, the most visually shocking part of the book is the pictures of the jaws and the teeth. And he would show you how, the populations that had the sugar and the flour would have the problems with their teeth, whereas the other population would have fine teeth. And it wasn't just, and then of course that helps you understand the importance of teeth to health, because he shows how the health of the teeth was a reflection of the health of the total body. So all of these diseases were beginning to show up as soon as people's teeth were beginning to rot. And it's because, what ruins your teeth will also ruin the rest of your body. They're just another organ of your body. And I think it's extremely telling. It's extremely compelling as well. But again, it's something that modern scientists choose to keep ignoring. What are your thoughts on why that is the case?
Yeah, it's very, very hard to understand. I've thought a lot about it, and I don't know that I have any, more insights on that particular part of the story than anybody else. But, one thing that was, very revealing to me was, I was looking at the smoking cancer connection, beginning to be discovered in the, initially in the 1930s, and then the sort of more convincing studies in the 1950s. And, one of the scientists who first sort of put the pieces together was the epidemiologist Richard Dahl, the famous British epidemiologist. And even when he was starting to collect his data and seeing that tobacco and smoking was a big part of the lung cancer problem, he could hardly believe it. He didn't want to believe it. He was looking for other hypotheses, because it just seemed such a natural part of daily life. Smoking, everybody smoked. It was what you did to relax. And, how could this be truly the cause of this horrible epidemic of lung cancer? So I think there's something analogous with sugar. And again, I always want to distinguish between sugar and blood sugar. And when I say sugar, I mean the sweet white stuff. Like, it's just, we serve it at every celebration, after every meal. It's just part of who we are. Like, how could this thing that's so much a part of our life actually be, quote unquote, secretly poisoning us or secretly driving these horrible epidemics? It just seems too awful to believe, or too painful to believe. So I think we just, kind of shrug. And, even to this day, we have hospitals full of vending machines full of sugar. It's just complete inability to absorb this. And it is unpleasant to absorb. And I struggle with it too. And my kids still eat sugar, and I fight with them, and it's hard. So I get that it's hard, but we just have to embrace it.
Yeah, I think a big part of this is just simply junkies. Like, if you try to confront an alcoholic and tell them, hey, your alcohol is ruining your life, or your drug addiction is ruining your life, whatever drug it is, it's very difficult to get an addict to objectively assess their addiction. It's just, they're emotionally geared in a way that wants to believe that this drug is harmless. It's good for me. It helps me socialize. It's helps me make friends. It helps me wind down. They're always trying to focus on the good parts of it. And it's just such a strong bias, which, everybody realizes that, alcoholics would have that. But it's only when you quit sugar that you realize just how much more ingrained in people the sugar addiction is. And I've personally, I've been on a carnivore diet for 7 years. So I've had zero sugar for 7 years. And before that, for about 4 years, I was on a low carb diet. So I was having less and less sugar. And it's just been absolutely shocking for me how difficult it is for people to accept that I'm just not eating this stuff. And I'm not out there trying to tell people not to eat it. Simply trying to convince them to just leave me alone and stop trying to stuff their white poison in my mouth is an extremely hard battle to win. I remember when I was working at a university, and there'd be, everybody starts liking everybody else because it's a great excuse to have sugar hit during the middle of the workday. So everybody wants to have birthday celebrations, and then they bring this massive sugar bomb. And I don't want to be antisocial, so I do want to join, but I also don't want to ruin my day. And by getting a big giant sugar hit in the middle of the day, I still want to work. I still want to teach. I want to focus. I don't want to have a sugar crash on my hand, and I don't want to have to spend the rest of the day doing sugar in order to keep my energy levels up. So, I go to the birthday and I just, happy birthday. And, I'm nice, but no, thank you. I'm not going to have the cake. And then that becomes the center of attention of everybody every time. Like, how can you not have the cake? Why wouldn't you have the cake? What's wrong with cake? Everybody wants to just really fight with the idea that you might reject cake. I'm not trying to tell them to stop eating it. I'm just trying to tell them, no, thank you. I don't want to have it. And there's such a strong desire amongst people to want to convince you that no, it's good, it's normal, you're just being ridiculous. Like, is something wrong with you? This is my favorite. Oh, is something wrong with you? Like, you must have some kind of massively debilitating disease that prevents you from engaging in this very harmless activity. And the answer is always no, nothing is wrong with me. I just don't like the way that sugar affects my body. I've tried living with sugar. I spent 30 years of my life being a massive sugar addict. I've tried every single sugar thing that is in your supermarket. I spent long periods of my life where I was heavily addicted to soda and candy, and I was a connoisseur of all these candies that you find in your supermarket. I've tried them all, but I've also tried going without them, and I found life without them to be much better than anything that they can offer. It's much more delicious. Having spent a month with zero sugar feels better than anything that you could get from the supermarket. And people just get really, really angry when you tell them that, because they're addicted to it, and no, it's clearly something that's wrong with you. I think that's a big part of it. It's just addicts. We live in a world in which this has been normalized, and it's I mean, if you've ever been sober around drunk people, you know how annoying it is. And I think those of us who don't do sugar, this is what it's like every day. I mean, all society is just sugar addicts running around from one excuse to indulge to another.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. When my kids were, my kids sort of understand more now. When they were younger, it would drive them crazy to the point where they like try to shove a cupcake in my mouth. Celebration. We're like, all right, I'll just have one just to quiet them down. But I don't know why it drives people crazy. But interestingly, I do think it's an addiction. But the way I think of the addiction is really that we're all insulin. I say we because I was a part of this too. I was addicted like you. I was eating sugar all the time. I used to at one point. I remember like in my early 20s, I didn't have much money. I was like carrying around a bag of white bread and just like taking out slices. Like that was my diet. So I was a part of it too. And I remember going to the doctor. I had elevated triglycerides. I had no idea what that meant. So I was clearly developing insulin resistance. But what I think is going on, most cases we're addicted because when you have this elevated, eat this sugar, you get this elevated insulin, and then it tells your adipose tissue, to store the nutrients. So you're taking in all this food, but it's getting locked away in your cells, and you're hungry all the time. So, it's a process that's driving hunger. So you're hungry for the exact foods that you don't want to eat.
Yeah. And I think also it's just understanding the psychology of the addiction is that at any point in time, you're either in the high where you've just enjoyed your sugar and you love it and you feel like sugar is the most amazing thing in life, and therefore anybody saying something bad about sugar is just a heretic that needs to be lynched. Or you're withdrawing from sugar. The high is rubbed off and now you're withdrawing and you're really craving your sugar, and anybody who's trying to tell you that sugar is bad for you is trying to get in the way of your next hit. And you don't want to be standing in the way of an addict and their hit. And so at all points in time, you're dealing with somebody whose entire psychology is fixated around the drug. And this is what drugs do to you. Like you're incapable of functioning without it, and your whole life begins to revolve around it. And I think it's this is not controversial thing to say about people, things that people understand as drugs like alcohol or hard drugs, but it's exactly applicable to sugar, with the difference being that sugar is completely normalized in society, and that it's perfectly normal for people to say, oh, I'm craving something sweet, or I'm feeling I have an energy crash, I'm going to go grab a donut, or I'm going to go grab a sugary drink or something like that. It's just been normalized as a normal part of life. Yeah, so if you have your energy levels down, then just grab something sugary and you'll be all right.
Yeah.
It's tragic.
Yeah. The best counter argument that I've come across, which, you've probably heard as well, some people will just say, you know what, I think you're right, but my life just would not be as good without sugar. I'm willing to take these risks because it adds so much pleasure and fun and daily satisfaction. And maybe that's true for some people, but it just seems hard to believe that, given, the severity of the consequences and the increased risk for so many diseases, that it could be worth it. But to me, that's the one argument that I have to throw up my hands at. Like, it really is worth it, then fine, but you know what the consequences are.
I'd be willing to entertain that argument if it comes from somebody who has tried going clean for a couple of months, and then gotten back and decided, no, you know what? The daily roller coaster of sugar addiction is more fun than being clean. And I'd say, to go clean, it's not just a day without sugar, because if you do it for a day, you're just going to be withdrawing and it's going to be hell. And that's generally the kind of answer that you get. It's like, yeah, I tried to go without sugar for a couple of days. I was miserable. I could not live without sugar. Well, yeah, obviously, if you're addicted to something and you're withdrawing from it, you're going to be miserable. But on the other side of that misery, once you've gone through the withdrawal, I find it a much, 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 much better way of living. And I think I'm not trying to tell anybody what to do, but I think before you decide, yeah, I'm willing to risk all of these horrific diseases and illnesses, see what life would be like without daily engaging in all of that.
Yeah. That raises another question is, what's the difference between, someone like me or you and somebody who sees all the same evidence and decides that it's not worth it? Like, what made it click for us? Because we could reproduce that, and I don't know what it is. My best guess is that I'm just more neurotic than the average person. And so, I started to think about the consequences more, and that spurred me into action. But I can't figure out like what it is that makes some people get it and others don't, because the evidence is the same.
In my case, it was getting to a point where I became overweight. I was insulin resistant, and I started really just feeling like crap every day. And then for me, it was like the addiction of reducing the amount of sugar became the addiction that I got into. So I started off by first, once I first became aware of this, I stopped drinking carbonated beverages that were full of sugar, and I stopped eating excess bread. Like, I just became conscious of those two things. As soon as I removed those two things from my diet, I immediately felt so much better. And it's just the very low hanging fruit, just don't drink sugary Pepsi and cola or whatever. And don't eat excess bread. If you're going to have a sandwich with a little less bread than you usually do. And that immediately made a huge difference in my health. And so then it became like an addiction. Like, well, what else can I do to make my health better? And then I just kept on removing more and more things. And now I'm left with only red meat and water, and been on it for 7 years. And I've seen no reason to change. Everybody gets really worked up when I tell them I eat like this, but nobody has shown me any evidence for why I need to introduce anything from plants into my food. And I've, every time I try, I just, I feel much worse.
Yeah. So you're only red meat and water. You're all the way there.
Yep. 7 years now.
Wow. what meat? Sorry, I'm taking over the interview. I'm curious
No,
what
please.
meat you eat.
Mostly beef, sometimes lamb. When I'm in the Middle East, I eat a lot more lamb than here, but it's mostly beef. I think having spent some more time in the Middle East now, I think I wouldn't be able to do it purely on lamb. I think I still need beef. So I could do it purely on beef. And I eat mostly flesh, muscle meat, but I also eat a lot of organ meat. I love organ meat, and I've always wanted it. I've always loved it. Even when I used to eat garbage, I always used to like organ meat because I lived in Lebanon, and in Lebanon they're very good at preparing it. So I still eat a lot of organ meats, but I don't really give it much thought in terms of this is the kind of really amazing thing about it for me is that I don't have to count anything. When I'm hungry, I eat fatty red meat until I'm not hungry anymore.
Yeah.
And if I'm thirsty, I drink water until I'm not thirsty anymore. And I salt to taste. And that's it.
All right. Well, you're inspiring me. I still got a way to go. I still have my keto ice cream sometimes. So
Yeah, it's much harder. Like when you're, I remember this phase when when I still had a little bit of plant food here and there. It's just you're still getting into the sugar roller coaster, and it still preoccupies your mind, and you're all constantly calculating how much sugar can I have today, and can I try this recipe, should I try that recipe? And there's always that temptation because you're doing a lot less of the drug, but you're still doing the drug. And if you just go zero, it's much easier. I think it was a few weeks ago I had Dr. Benjamin Bickman on the podcast, and he's also on the same page as you, saying that it's insulin resistance. And he said Saint Augustine. He quoted Saint Augustine, who said abstinence is much easier than. I forget the exact quote, but completely abstaining is easier than doing things in moderation, because moderation in an addictive thing is just constantly getting you to desire more and more of it. So you need a lot more willpower to manage to stay on this narrow, straight path when you're diverting a little bit and having to come back. Whereas if you just stay on it, it just gets easier.
yeah, no, it makes sense. But I guess in relation to what we were talking about before, people it did click as far as smoking. Like people, the medical world eventually did accept that smoking causes lung cancer. So it seems like there has to be a model for getting this message through that's based on that. And that's another thing I've tried to figure out is how you make that leap. And part of the problem is that it's just a simpler problem in terms of the epidemiology with smoking. Very easy to see who smoked and who didn't smoke. Whereas with diet, you have all these complicating factors. Nobody eats only sugar, so you just harder to present the evidence in a way that people will accept. And that's why partially why I focus on the insulin, because the picture is much more clear. And then you just have to ask the secondary question is, okay, if insulin is really so carcinogenic at high levels every day, then the question just comes down to what causes the insulin resistance. And that's where the sugar connection is so clear and strong.
Yeah, I think the case is extremely compelling, and it's not just the cancer; it's also diabetes and obesity and all kinds of other illnesses. And in the episode with Dr. Bickman, we extensively discussed all the different ways in which insulin resistance is implicated in so many of modern diseases. What really boggles my mind, and I said this to Dr. Bickman, is just it's the extremely counterproductive way of thinking of not going for the low-hanging fruit. When you've got so much evidence pointing toward a single culprit, this is what any doctor should be saying. When the kid walks into your clinic and they eat candy, your job as a doctor is to be the party pooper and tell him stop eating candy. And it's amazing that people don't go for that low hanging fruit, and instead they prefer to overcomplicate things, to look for extremely elaborate explanations, to look for extremely really silly rationalizations. Well, maybe it's genetics. Well, maybe we need another $30 million grant to go to this university department to look at what is it about which gene is it that causes this and that. Or just have less candy. It sounds like such an obviously easier solution.
The real problem, I've thought about this when thinking about Dr. Beekman, and the problem is that it sounds too good to be true. I think it is true, but nobody can believe that insulin resistance could be responsible for so many different conditions. It would almost be better if it was a little less comprehensive, just so you can convince people. But there's more and more evidence coming out with psychiatric illness. I don't know if you've followed the work of Chris Palmer at all. He'd be a good guest if you haven't had him yet. But he's really, showing the relationships between metabolic illness and insulin resistance and psychiatric illness. And, obviously the diabetes, cardiovascular stuff is well understood, and, it just goes on and on.
Absolutely. So you may be wondering, why is it that a Bitcoin podcast is interested in this topic? It's a question we get often. I'm not sure how familiar you are with Bitcoin, but let me give you a little bit of the kind of why I, as an economist, am interested in these topics, and in a wide variety of topics. The most common bit of feedback that I get is, hey, you're an economist, stick to numbers and charts rather than telling people what to eat. But for me, I think what is truly interesting and fascinating about this topic and many other topics is, in my mind, how the financing and the funding of science has helped get scientists stuck down these many dead ends where they just don't revise their hypotheses even after decades of reality assaulting them. So I first became familiar with this in economics, because that's my field of expertise, where I did my PhD. And so you look at the Keynesian consensus on what constitutes an economy. Just yesterday, the Ben Bernanke, who was chairman of the Federal Reserve, received what is falsely called the Nobel Prize in economics. There's no Nobel Prize. It's a Swedish central bank prize trying to hang on the coattails of Alfred Nobel to try and make their pseudoscience sound respectable. But in any case, this is presented as if it is, a science, and that everybody understands how an economy works. And people like Ben Bernanke are out there advancing our scientific knowledge and helping the world get better at economics, which is complete garbage. Essentially, people like Ben Bernanke are just out there to repeat the conclusion that all of the world's problems are fixed by handing more money to banks and letting central banks print money. That's the conclusion. All of the scholarship that goes into arriving at the conclusion is completely interchangeable and irrelevant. It's just after the fact rationalization to arrive at the answer. It's inflationism is the thing that they want, and then scholarship is rewarded if it arrives at that conclusion. And so we've had decades of evidence that shows that inflation is not the solution to economic problems. Inflation is actually the cause to these economic problems. But it's impossible to get published in a reputable journal in economics if you carry such controversial ideas, as they like to call them. And I think the same thing is true in nutrition. Having seen how, it is possible for all of these supposed Nobel Prize winning scientists, all these top universities, to be so completely wrong. That's what opened my mind and my eyes up to the possibility that, hey, maybe all of the nutritionists are wrong too. And then, if you ignore what the nutritionists say and you go and you eat the unscientific diet of not stuffing your face with highly toxic sugars every day, you find yourself feeling much better and healthier. Of course, you're surrounded by scientists telling you, oh no, you're depriving your body of essential Twinkies and Pringles and Doritos, and you can't do that to yourself. But if you can overcome the gaslighting, you can eventually, it just becomes very obvious that you're much better off living like this. Similarly, I think we see this in all these fields. I think in cancer research is another one, because the common theme in my mind is that funding for science is no longer a free market. There is no free market in the funding of science, because in a free market, scientists would be free to propose any hypotheses, and if your hypothesis is correct, it ends up helping people, and then people become better off, and then they pay you more money for they buy your book, they subsidize they donate to your university's graduates end up being more successful at treating people's illnesses. And so in a free market, the scientific theories that concord best with reality are the ones that would survive and would succeed. Whereas in the current situation, we have that feedback loop from reality severed because the financing doesn't come from the real world. It doesn't matter if the nutritionists graduating from the School of Nutrition go out there and poison people, because that's not how they're going to be financing the nutrition department. The financing for the nutrition department comes from up above. It comes from the money printer, basically. The government is what finances it. The government is what finances most university research. The government is what finances student loans. So you have to basically go along with the prevailing school of thought, with the prevailing dogma, in order to get funding. And that's a mechanism that prevents any kind of serious revision of science, and that's basically what prevents science from making any progress. Because the way that you would have progress is, all right, well, we have this stupid theory that says cancer is purely genetic. Well, if people go around and they tell people, oh, yep, you have cancer because it's your genes, anybody who goes and gets, goes to these doctors will not make any improvement. Whereas people who go to doctors and who tell them, hey, all right, maybe it is your genes, but let's try and get you off junk food for a couple of months and see what happens, and then people get better, and then people improve, or people start getting less exposure, less incidence of cancer in these populations. These doctors would be successful, their universities would be successful, and then eventually they would outcompete the other ones. We don't have that. We don't have that in when it comes to heart disease. We don't have that when it comes to the cholesterol theory of heart disease. We don't have that when it comes to cancer. And so these kind of dead ends of science are what interest me the most, in that people like you and people like Dr. Bickman and people like Dr. Malcolm Kendrick, who was also a guest here a couple of weeks ago, you can marshal enormously compelling evidence for your theories, and yet it's very difficult for universities to adopt that. What has been your experience in that regard, in terms of just how hard it is to get scientists to change their mind?
Yeah, no, I mean, a lot of what you said certainly resonates with what I know and in my experience.
Mhm.
And, I think part of it is that, there's a lot of brilliant people that are attracted to medical school and to science, but they, are brilliant, but at the same time, not the sort of type of personalities that would necessarily be prepared to, contradict what they've been taught or to challenge conventional thinking. So, in addition to the money, I think the field attracts a certain type of thinking. There are certainly plenty of exceptions, but I remember talking to Lewis Cantley. He is, a brilliant scientist who really pieced together a lot of the insulin science at the molecular level and showed, how these pathways are driven by insulin that are related to cancer. And I said to him, how can it be that not everybody is talking about this, given the significance? And he said that, the world that he's in is thought of as diabetes or endocrinology, and he's showing that it's connected to cancer. But there's a separate group of specialists that are focused on cancer that don't want to think about any of this. There's no incentive, as you explained so eloquently, for anybody to change, to go outside of the box. So no one, makes these connections. I think that's a big part of it. And, the other part of it is that, there's just no way to provide the level of proof that will satisfy, some of these thinkers. The RCT, of course, you would like to have, but, as I said earlier, you're just not gonna, give people sugar at high doses over 20 years. It would be unethical. So it's sort of a dead end, and you just have to be able to make that leap from, just a massive amount of evidence from different directions, all pointing towards the same thing. But, it's interesting backstory here, which, might interest you, is Gary Taubes, who, I think is a very brilliant scientific thinker, despite being a journalist, and has influenced my thought. So he was on an econ podcast, I believe it's called Econ Talk, years ago, and was talking about some of these issues. And I recall that he and the host were making an analogy between macroeconomics and nutrition science. And one of the listeners to that podcast was John Arnold. I don't know if you've heard of him. He's a billionaire in Houston, a gas trader. And he ended up putting up a lot of money to try to, test some of these theories, and that turned into a bit of a debacle. But it was interesting. We can get into all that. Gary Taubes had the idea that he was going to get all of his his scientific enemies to test these theories, and it got really sticky and complicated. But I do think these kind of conversations can make a big difference. You never know where the science is going to lead. And ultimately, John Arnold funded some really important studies as well, in terms of stuff David Ludwig at Harvard has done, showing how low carb diets can actually increase the metabolic rate. So I think it's great that you're doing this and having these conversations. You never know who's listening and how it's going to change the science one day.
Yeah, I think, in my book, The Fiat Standard, I have a chapter on fiat science. And one way I describe it is that fiat science is all about who gets to determine the null hypothesis, and then they get to determine the burden of proof. So nobody has carried out randomized controlled trials to prove that it is the genes that are causing cancer. You can't do that, but somehow it's still an accepted hypothesis. That's it, as well as it is genetic. When you're coming with government funding, you don't have to make any proof, and then the onus of proof is on the people that are opposing you. And that's why, and then of course, the onus of the burden of proof just continues to get more and more ridiculous. And so these experiments are set up in ways that just can basically set them up for failure. You set up the experiment in any way you want, you get whatever result that you want. And it's just extremely, extremely biased. I haven't really followed the case of Gary Taubes and that book, and I'm not entirely sure, and John Arnold. I've heard vaguely about it, but I'm not entirely sure how it went down. But I think that there's an enormous establishment that even one billionaire coming in and trying to spend money is no match for 50 years of funding and scientists and PhDs who are basically being told, hey, let's go ahead and set up these experiments in a way that if they show the result that this journalist, supposedly it's just massive insult, this journalist, Gary Taubes, if he's right, then that would say that 50 years of PhDs are basically garbage and you people need to go back to high school and learn your biology from scratch. There's not going to be a fair fight there. They're not going to agree to terms of experiments that are done in a way that it gonna arrive at these kind of results. And so you end up always coming up with these enormously contrived burdens of proof on people who want to present it. But of course, again, this is why I'm a much bigger fan of bro science rather than modern university science, because you have, on the other hand, you have people, you have personal trainers on Instagram that have been training hundreds and thousands of people. And they know, you're fat. All right, well, cut down on the junk food and you'll get better. And it's, you don't have to overcomplicate things. The results speak for themselves. So many people see the results and so many people benefit from it. You have so many groups on Facebook of people from all over the world reporting results on improvements in things like this. And zero curiosity among scientists to explain it. For instance, I just recently got my blood work done after 7 years of carnivore. Everybody's always telling me you need to go get your bloods checked. And according to modern science, somebody who's eaten nothing but fatty meat for 7 years should be, dead or on the verge of death at this point. And yet my scores were just perfect. Like nobody would say that. One example like that should be enough to get all scientists to sit back and revisit what's going on. And I'm not the only one. There's thousands of carnivores and low carb dieters who eat a lot of very high fat and don't develop the things that we're told by nutritionists and doctors should be the consequence of high fat. A real science would take any of these as an extremely important and interesting observation. You can't just say, oh, it's just an n equals to 1. No, it's not an n equals to 1. You only need an n equal to 1 to falsify a theory. If the sun rises from the west tomorrow, that deletes everything that we know about astronomy. We can't just say, oh, well, it's just one day. No, it's not just one day. It has to work. If a theory is correct, if it's a law of science, it has to work every time. And you should be investigating that. Instead, you see, and I'm sure you come across this, you see the kind of very anti-scientific rationalization that people try and come up with to dismiss results which go against what they what they would expect. And so it's, oh well, maybe your your genes, or maybe this, or maybe that, or it's just an exception, or it's not a randomized control trial, we need to get more data, n equals to 1 doesn't matter. It's as long as you have the funding, then you can get to call the shots, and it doesn't matter. You can come up with any kind of silly justification. As long as you don't convince yourself, then the other party is hopeless. Which is, why Bitcoin, I think, is really interesting in this, because the way that I think this is going to be fixed is not that we're going to be arguing with Harvard professors to convince them about this stuff. I think the way Bitcoin is going to fix this is, a world in which people can save their wealth in Bitcoin is a world in which inflation cannot be used to finance all the insane things that government finances, and that includes insane fiat science. And so in a world in which people are protected from theft through inflation, scientists would need to earn their funding out on the open. And this is where I think Bitcoin really offers the potential to fix science. It's just we're not going to nicely argue with the people whose life and paycheck depends on repeating the dogma of their fields. We're just going to bankrupt them, and then they're going to need to either adjust to reality in order to eat, or not eat.
Well, I'm ashamed to say that I know very little about Bitcoin, but I will start learning and start listening more, so I learn more.
Okay, so we skipped over Warburg, but I did want to discuss his life, which I think is very fascinating, and also the significance of his research at that time in Germany. So at that time in Weimar Germany and in Nazi Germany, cancer rates were spiking, and they were increasing a lot. What do you think were the explanations that at that time for why that was the case? What did Warburg think?
Yeah, so that's a big part of this story. We've already talked about it a little bit, but the cancer was rising in most Western countries, really anywhere where they had adopted this Western diet, including in Germany. So you have in the beginning of the 20th century and the late 19th century, these cancer rates going up and up and up. And German science is really at the top of the world. They're conquering almost, conquering all these infectious diseases. Robert Koch has, elucidated how microorganisms cause disease, but the cancer is driving them crazy. It's the one disease they can't make any progress against, despite all these brilliant scientific minds. So I think the reason Warburg took on cancer is because it was the disease of the day. He wanted to make a world-changing discovery. He had paintings on his wall of Pasteur and Paul Ehrlich and Robert Koch, and he thought, the next person in this line will be the person who conquers cancer. And, there were cancer exhibits going all over Germany, and Germany was pouring more and more money into it and really making very little progress. And then, one of the fascinating things that took place, which, I write about in my book, is that, the Nazis inherited this German cancer establishment and actually did make a little bit of progress in terms of funding some sort of, test of prevention. They were the first to make the smoking cancer connection. So, it can be mystifying for some people how Nazi science could have done anything good. And, I really talk a lot in my book about the Stanford historian Robert Proctor, who wrote this book called The Nazi War on Cancer, where, he shows that the Nazis were so obsessed with the purity of the body and disease that, cancer to them was sort of one more agent. They even thought, it was potentially an infectious agent that they were going to conquer to, kind of purify the Aryan body. So their attack on cancer actually got sort of rolled into this weird, horrifying Nazi ideology. But partly because of that, they were so desperate to conquer cancer, and they were so panicked about it. And Hitler himself was a hypochondriac and obsessed with cancer that they protected Warburg in the end and allowed him to continue his research. So, you mentioned at the beginning, he was not only, of Jewish heritage, but also more or less openly gay. And yet again and again, the Nazis protected him. He provoked them. He would kick Nazi brown shirts out of his laboratory when they'd come to harass him. And, it almost cost him his life. In 1941, they brought him into Nazi headquarters, and it looked like it might be the end, but they decided that, so long as he focused on cancer, they were going to let him go. And, at a moment of the war when they weren't using gasoline, for anything but the war effort, they stopped and built Warburg a new institute in the countryside. And I think they really believed that he was going to cure cancer. And he was certainly saying that. So it's a pretty incredible story. He was the only, out of all these Kaiser Wilhelm institutes that were full of Jewish scientists, he was the only one to make it in his position all the way to the end of the war.
Yeah, it's truly fascinating because pretty much all the other scientists had fled to the US or Russia by that time, all the other Jewish scientists, I should say. But he remained there, and it's interesting. And you say that the reason is that Hitler, or part of the reason that Hitler was fascinated by this and obsessed with it, was because his own mother died from cancer.
Yeah. Yeah, that was a really incredible story. His mother died of cancer, right at the time when Hitler's life was sort of falling apart. His father had already died. He had just been rejected from art school and was, extremely depressed about that. And then he comes home and his mother's dying of cancer. And she's actually being cared for by a Jewish doctor, Edward Bloch. And Hitler likes this doctor, and they spend a lot of time together. The doctor's by her side every day. And when the doctor, the day his mother died, the doctor shows up in the morning. Hitler is sitting by her dead body. And the doctor later wrote that he's never seen a more depressed human being in his life, never seen a more forlorn expression. And, some historians have hypothesized that maybe Hitler's, his feeling towards Jews was somehow wrapped up in all of this, that he associated the doctor with the disease and his mother's death. But I don't think there's much evidence for that. In fact, he allowed this doctor to escape Austria. I do think that probably explains why Hitler was obsessed with cancer, but I don't think it explains all the Jewish ideology.
But another interesting thing that you mentioned in the book was Hitler was also obsessed with sugar, wasn't he?
Yeah.
Tell us more about that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sometimes hesitant to even get into that because, it's really kind of a side point. It's just.
No, it's fine. Let's trigger sugar addicts more. We haven't triggered them enough yet.
Okay. So, it just so happens that, Hitler was crazy. He had a lot of weird obsessions, but it so happens that I don't know that I've ever heard of a human being who consumed more sugar. I mean, he was the addict of all addicts. He put like 7 teaspoons of sugar in his tea, and would just, his chef, recorded some memories of how he would just consume sugar all day. And, I don't think it caused his mental illness and his psychosis, but I'm sure it didn't help things. And, I do like the irony that even as he was, claiming that he was doing all these healthy things and purifying the Aryan body, he was meanwhile poisoning himself. I mean, by the time he killed himself, he could barely walk. I mean, he was just an absolute wreck. And he was taking, he had been a drug addict as well. There's a book on that called, what's it called? You probably know the book. But in any case.
What drugs was he into?
Well, he was taking, basically speed, that his personal doctor had been giving him for many years, and all sorts of other medications. They were just injecting him all the time. At the end, in the last days in the bunker, the only drug, as the author of that book says, the only drug he has left, it's called Blitzed. The only drug he had left was sugar. So he was just eating sugar constantly. And, I think he would have died very, very soon after. He was just in horrible shape had he not committed suicide at that point.
Big cake fan, apparently.
As dentist, he of course had horrible teeth as well. So we've talked about the dental thing. His dentist despised Hitler, but not because he was Hitler, but because his teeth were so awful. But again, I don't want to send the message that I think sugar caused Nazism. It can be blamed for a lot of things. And the Nazi actually did, at the agricultural level, they actually did benefit from the sugar industry. But I don't think it's the best explanation for Hitler's psychosis.
I'm gonna run with it anyway. Uh, no, but I think also what's fascinating here is so two things. First of all, his fascination with cancer and his fascination with Warburg is just this kind of it's the addict's guilt, where on the one hand he needs to keep indulging in the drug, but on the other hand he's really trying to help this scientist who he suspects deep down inside suspects this guy clearly is onto something, and that guy's onto the thing that you hate the most. So he's trying to effectively, it's like the addict's wish that, hey, if we just let Warburg do his thing, then one day he's going to be able to figure out a way to basically fix cancer that doesn't involve me having to quit my sugars. I think is one way of looking at it. Would you agree?
I mean, I should say that, I think everything you say may be circling around the truth, but the evidence, it gets a little murky. What happens is Hitler, Warburg is brought in June 21st, 1941. Warburg is brought into Nazi headquarters. He's been evicted from his institute. And, I did a lot of research on this day, but what really blew me away is that, only later after I started research, I realized that June 21st, 1941 is not just any day in Nazi history. It's only hours before Operation Barbarossa, when the Nazis, risk everything to go into the Soviet Union. So this all happens at the most critical moment. Warburg's brought into Nazi headquarters. We know that Hitler is in the building on that day. I found in Himmler's diary, he has a meeting about Warburg that day. And then Warburg is asked to meet with this guy who's essentially the head of Hitler's personal chancellery, and he passes on the message. So, and then later that night, I have from Goebbels' diary, Hitler and Goebbels are talking about cancer research. So there's all these different points of evidence pointing towards Hitler's direct involvement, but there's not like this smoking gun. But the other really fascinating part of this story is that Hitler, Warburg, one way for somebody like Warburg to survive in Nazi Germany was to have his status, quote unquote, upgraded. He was considered half Jewish, but if he had been, again, quote unquote, upgraded to a quarter Jewish, then he would be, more likely to survive in Nazi Germany. So Warburg puts in this application, and Hitler would personally review these applications in the middle of the war effort. This is what he's doing. He's poring over, these applications that have different pictures, and he's trying to figure out if this person has a Jewish nose or not, and just the craziest stuff. So I know that Warburg's application had to have passed his desk because he approved these things, but I can't say exactly what Hitler thought about Warburg, despite looking for that evidence. Yeah, and I can say that he was obsessed with cancer. Certainly, there's an amazing amount of evidence there.
Yeah, and also we do know that Hitler was, he may not have been a vegetarian, but he thought vegetarianism was the way forward for humanity, right?
Yeah, he and Himmler were both, obsessed with vegetarian diets and getting meat out of, the Nazi diet. And, he himself, was into organic fruits and vegetables that he would have, flown to him when he was in his various bunkers and whatnot. So yeah, he tended to get everything wrong, including nutrition.
Yeah, and I think this is not considered. You could taint anything by any kind of shred of guilt of association to Hitler, except this one. Somehow the thing that he ate all day, every day, the sugar and the lack of meat, is somehow completely unrelated to all of the insane things that he did. But I think they're highly related, because from my experience and from the experience of many people that I see, I find the more meat you eat, the less sugar you crave. This is, I think, a very, very important, probably part of the reason why meat is so vilified. I think this is something that food marketing has figured out a long time ago. Food scientists have been running data on how to get people to eat more of their highly addictive crap for a very long time. And I think the reason that meat is vilified is that if you eat a lot of meat, you don't crave a lot of sugary stuff. on the other hand, if you don't eat meat, and this is kind of what a lot of people say is, oh, well, I cut down on meat and I feel better. Well, no, you cut down on meat and then you're malnourished. And then because you're malnourished, you're constantly hungry. And then you fix that by engaging in essentially a very elaborate sugar habit. And so you feel better because you're basically high on sugar all the time. And in the short run, this feels great. I mean, if you replace nutrition with drugs, that's a great recipe for a fun weekend, but it's not going to be very sustainable in the long run. It's going to cause a lot of damage. So, I'm obviously not saying this is the cause, but I don't think this is the cause for what he did. But I think it's arguably, and it doesn't obviously, I think, cause his ideologies and all his insane and criminal ideas. But I think it's this kind of malnutrition is not something that can just be forgotten. I think I'd urge somebody to try to go 3 months on a carnivore diet and then to go 3 months on sugar and lots of sugar and cake, and do the Hitler diet of very little meat and a lot of sugar and cake, and then see how you change as a human being. And I dare you to then tell me that no, it doesn't make a difference.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think at the very least you could say that he was someone who had erratic mood swings, and that these insane sugar habit could not have helped. That's in a situation like that, it would just contribute to even more erratic mood swings. But another interesting thing that relates to what you're saying is you talked about how some people eat less meat and say they're doing better. But what I've found is that some people go to a vegan diet and they say that they've never done better, but when they go to these vegan diets, they're often cutting out refined carbs and sugar at the same time. So I'm thinking, okay, yeah, of course you're doing better if you're cutting out all the sugar you're eating.
Yeah, this is a very common misconception people have, which is, they move to the vegan diet at the same time where they will quit, so for them is, all right, I'm going to quit McDonald's. They used to eat McDonald's 5 times a week, and they'd have that big giant meal of seed oil fried fries and the Pepsi and the bun and the sugary treats. Yeah, they quit all of that, and in their mind, that's part of what it is to go vegan, because there's that tiny little bun in the middle of the big giant meal, or the little chicken McNuggets, and then they think, all right, well, because I quit that bun, that's why my health improved. But really, the reason is you've replaced all of the sugary junk and the highly processed crap that comes with that bun with with what is usually far less harmful stuff, like basically organic grown vegetables and fruits, fresh. I mean, obviously that's much better than eating highly processed stuff, but I personally will eat a lot of these burger patties from fast food restaurants, and I'll subsist on them. And when I'm traveling, it's my go-to. I just stop at McDonald's or Burger King, and I'll have 6, 7, 8 of these patties, and I'm set for the day. I think it's great. It's just pure beef, and it's delicious, and it's quick, and it's cheap, and it's great. So I think if you quit all of the rest of the stuff that comes with the junk food and kept the patties, you'd do even better than if you just have the fruits and veggies.
I had a friend who wanted to start a keto fast food restaurant, and I pointed out that they are already keto if you just throw out the buns and the fries and the drinks.
Yeah, it's true, and it's extremely cheap, and it's everywhere. It's amazing. I mean, it's anywhere you go, there's one of these places, and you can just have all of the meat that you want. So then, what happens to Warburg after the war? Tell us more about his story.
Yeah, so after the war, unfortunately, it was sort of a decline for Warburg. He had been, somewhat traumatized, understandably, about his experience in Nazi Germany, and he was, a difficult, somewhat paranoid personality already. So after the war, he becomes a little bit of a pariah. The Rockefeller Foundation had supported him. That was another incredible thing. The Rockefeller Foundation built an institute for him in Germany. But after the war, people were a little suspicious of how he survived. Did he, somehow collaborate with the Nazis. So he didn't, and he didn't deserve that suspicion, but people sort of washed their hands from him. But he didn't help his own case, because he was making more and more extreme statements about cancer, saying the thing that he discovered, this Warburg effect, was the only thing that anybody needed to know. Everything else was garbage, So, he made it easy for people to knock down his arguments. And a lot of it came down to this one scientific question. Warburg was saying that in a true cancer, there's no more respiration. The cells are no longer breathing oxygen. And people were able to refute that and say, look, in some of these cancers, the respiration is continuing. They agreed with him that the fermentation, the backup engine, the aerobic glycolysis was taking place, but they said Warburg was still wrong because the respiration. So if he had just made less extreme statements, it would have really helped a lot. But he made the most extreme statements, and then people started to discredit him. And then, in the meantime, you have, as we've already talked about, the rise of the genetic hypothesis. And then once that took hold, then everything Warburg, believed about metabolism and the centrality of metabolism to cancer sort of went into the background. And, Warburg dies in 1970. And, by the mid 80s, people have almost like completely forgotten about his thinking. The idea is that cancer is an entirely genetic disease, and the stuff that Warburg studied is, kind of the old school biochemistry, the old school nutrition. It has nothing to do with the exciting new molecular biology. And, people are throwing out their Warburg manometers, these devices that they use to measure respiration, and the posters of metabolic pathways are coming off the walls, being replaced with, these new, molecular biology protein signaling pathways. And so it's really, for a few decades, just wiped off, the scientific map, kind of all the stuff that we've talked about. But, there are a number of reasons it came back. But, one of them, is kind of amazing, is that, this new tests arise, the PET scan, which, is a key diagnostic tool to this day, which diagnoses cancer, just by looking at where in the body extra glucose is being taken up. And that's a sign that, this Warburg metabolism is going on. So even as Warburg was being sort of, removed from the discussion, this central point about the metabolism of cancer was, being introduced to every cancer institute, this PET scan. And then in the late 90s, you start to have the beginnings of this real synthesis where people are able, these geneticists who are trying to figure out what takes place inside the cancer cell are quite surprised to find all these old enzymes from Warburg's days are suddenly a part of these networks that they've been studying. So they traced, they kind of left Warburg behind, then traced the pathway through the cell, and it led them right back to the enzymes that control the way a cell eats. And once they got there, it suddenly made so much sense. The analogy used by Chi Van Dang, one of these scientists, is that cancer is a building project, and you can't organize and create a building project if you have no control, if you're not integrating the fuel supply into this. It can't just be that the fuel randomly shows up. So I think the evidence looks like the causation was largely backwards in a sense. It's you have these first early stage of the process where a cell gains the ability to overconsume nutrients, and that sort of awakens this. Oh, I've got all this extra fuel coming in. Maybe I can start to build new things. It sort of awakens the demon inside, and that's what a lot of scientists now think that the origins of cancer are. It's this extra fuel coming in, and a cell gaining the ability not just to use it for more energy, but to actually create the building blocks of daughter cells and allowing cancer cells to divide and build because they have the fuel to do it.
Yeah, I think it's, obviously this isn't my field of expertise and I don't claim to have all the answers for it. I think it would just, it's mind-boggling that more people aren't researching that. This is what I find really valuable about your work, and what I find really puzzling about, all the other dead ends down which cancer research will go, because and there is, of course, another aspect to this, which is that junk food industry is obviously not going to be excited about results like this. They're highly unlikely to be financing scientists to go around and dig and find out how bad their food really is for cancer. They'd much rather pursue other avenues of research. Well, maybe it's genetics, maybe it's all these tiny little particulates, maybe it's microplastics or something like that. I think maybe there is something like that. All the other explanations, as long as people aren't digging into this one very, very, very obvious giant elephant in the room.
But here's the interesting thing. What I just talked about in terms of tracing the cancer to these Warburg enzymes, like a lot of scientists are working on that part of the problem. They are interested in that. What they're not willing to do, with some very notable exceptions, is take the logic one step further. Like if this one particular pathway, this is called the PI3K pathway, if it can be excited by a mutation, then that's not controversial. They're very interested in studying that. But what if that same pathway could be excited and be activated all the time because you're eating the wrong diet and insulin is triggering it all the time? Now that takes the logic one step further back to diet. And that's where the interest drops off, with some notable exceptions. Lewis Cantley, who has pioneered all this stuff, is actually very active in talking about sugar. So I think we have to credit some of these scientists, but to me, it's just the surprising leap. If they see the problem and they see, oh, well, we can, the orientation is immediately, okay, let's create a drug that targets that, but refusing to take the next step is, okay, but what if diet could also target that?
Yeah, and I mean, what's really mind-boggling about this is that, like, it's all right. Sure, junkies love their drugs, but it's really not that difficult to cut out sugar. It's a lot easier than chemotherapy. Obviously, it's nowhere near as profitable. That's the thing. Like, there's a lot more money to be made from feeding you poison and then treating you with chemotherapy than from making you avoid the poison and not giving you chemotherapy. So this is I think the sad part of the story.
Yeah, it does. It's sort of sad that it's come to this, but it does raise the question, I think, is it possible that we will have the drugs that will restore metabolic health even in the face of massive sugar consumption? It seems possible that we might get there, and that might be the only way out. There are new drugs coming along. I mean, it's a shame, but whatever restores it, I'll take. One drug that a lot of people have had success with is metformin. They're all going to turn out to be diabetes drugs, of course. The evidence isn't clear cut, but just by restoring glucose metabolism and lowering insulin levels, metformin may already be a extremely valuable cancer drug.
Yeah, but then again, the problem with these is, even if it is effective, well, if you're addicted to sugar, then all that the effectiveness does is that it's going to allow you to indulge more in your addiction. So it's going to protect you and let you indulge more. And like there's no limit to how much sugary addictive junk you can keep eating.
Yeah, but I'm just saying, in theory, you could imagine that, maybe a new drug that blocks the increase, that prevents fructose from causing the buildup of fat in the organs. You could imagine a world in which one could eat all the sugar and not just cause insulin resistance. But I'm not optimistic that we're going to get to that anytime soon. And I don't think it's the best way we should be thinking about it. But it may be our last hope.
Yeah, I mean, I think the way that I like to think of it is it's similar to saying, we need to find a way to invent a laptop that can withstand being thrown from the 20th story window. And, maybe we'll invent some laptop like that. But there's a much better way, which is just don't throw your laptop off the 20th floor. Don't throw your laptops out of windows in general.
I'll just to play devil's advocate, just because I've talked with doctors about this issue, and what they, I sometimes make these arguments to them, and they say, like, okay, everything you're saying is true, but you don't understand what I'm up against. Like, you're telling me not, this person has like 3 Cinnabon for breakfast. Like, if I could get this person to only eat 1 Cinnabon, that would be like a great victory. Like they say, like, I just have no appreciation for how far gone, or how difficult it is to get some of these patients off their diet. So, I'm sympathetic to that, but it doesn't mean we should throw up our hands.
I'm not very sympathetic to that, because these same doctors are the same ones that tell you that you should be eating the standard American balanced diet. They're telling you that in order for you to remain healthy, you need to get 6 to 11 portions of grains every day. You need to eat 5 fruits and vegetables every day. And all of that is practically zero nutrition. You can round all of the nutrients in all of that into basically zero, and then they tell you to eat a little bit of protein, which can be meat or industrial grains, soy and beans and stuff, and they make no distinction between the two. So like, if you give people this dietary advice, you're setting them up to get to the place where they're going to be starving every day, and they're going to need sugar all the time to keep them able to function, and they're going to end up having 3 cinnamons for breakfast. This is a recipe for that. You're prescribing malnutrition, and then the natural reaction to that malnutrition is sugar addiction. So I have very little sympathy to these doctors, because those doctors themselves, they'll, if you told them, all right, so what should this patient be eating? It's not very different from 3 cinnamons in the morning. It's, yeah, have some whole grain cereal in the morning with low skim, with skim milk, which is, maybe not as bad as 3 cinnamons, but it's not much better. If those doctors were telling people to just eat meat and avoid the sugar and avoid the junk and avoid the grains, it would be very different. And I think the really inexcusable thing for me is that doctors think of their job as being to win popularity contests. They're out there to tell people what they want to hear. That's not your job. Leave that to the kid's mom to try and figure out, how to square your strict and harsh recommendations with what the kids wants. But you should be the voice of conscience in this. I've never heard of a doctor who does this, but I think, if in a sane world, I think a 10-year-old is overweight, they go to see their doctor. I think the doctor should sit them down and show them pictures of diabetic 25, 35, 40-year-olds having their legs amputated because of diabetes, showing them how they're going to become overweight. I think that, you should be showing them these things in an extremely scary, extremely shocking, jarring way, and just tell them, hey, yeah, if you want to keep having this garbage for breakfast, this is where you're going to end up. I'm going to have to amputate your leg one day. I think that's what doctors should be doing. But, that's completely unthinkable for most doctors. They're out there basically coddling people and telling them, hey, just go and have these 6 to 11 portions of grains and have maybe, have less of this and less of that. And here's a medicine for you to help you. And and of course, here's your ADHD. Here's some speed for you to help you get over the sugar addiction that you're with. It's zero interest in tackling the causes. Why not? Why shouldn't the doctor's office be a place to terrify unhealthy kids? Why shouldn't the unhealthy kid go back from the doctor's office crying, thinking, oh my God, they're going to cut my legs off? I think a lot of 10-year-olds would have benefited enormously from that. A lot of the very unhealthy 40-year-olds today would be a lot happier today, living much more fulfilling lives, much healthier lives, less sick, in much better shape, if they'd gone through just one day like that when they were 10 years old, before they hit puberty.
Kind of related to that, I said before, I could have written largely the same book about, diabetes or, cardiovascular disease or other diseases. And, one of the reasons I thought it would be a good idea to focus on cancer is that, I think cancer is scarier than the other diseases, that if people could see this connection between insulin resistance and cancer, it would cause them to change their diet in a way that's seeing the connection between, diabetes should be scary, but I think, it's not scary in the same way for a lot of people. So I think for that reason, the cancer messaging, is really important. The other complicating factor that's come up, and, I've talked about this with my wife, I have daughters, is she's sometimes, concerned that if I talk about diet and eating too much, that it could backfire, that the kids will rebel against it, or it could cause eating disorders. So it gets hard, but I tend to agree with you that the best thing we can do is make sugar seem as scary as possible.
Yeah, I get that a lot. People always tell me, well, if you make this such an issue for your kids, they're going to rebel. Maybe, but I also think, insulin resistance is is not something that happens overnight. Every time you get sugar, you're getting one step closer to insulin resistance. And so as long as they're under my roof, I'm not going to actively build their insulin resistance in order to avoid potential kind of rebellion that they'll have one day. And I think the other thing that people miss from this is that most of the people who say this don't realize the importance of proper nutrition and don't realize the fact that the reason people get addicted to sugar is because they're not eating enough meat. They're not getting real nutrition. And so if you're getting enough nutrition, then all right, you'll still maybe, you'll rebel and you'll want to get more sugar. And, when you're no longer living under your parents' house, that's going to be your teenage rebellion. But if you spent all of your youth eating meat and you're well nourished and you can handle meat and you're well used to it and you continue to eat meat properly, then there's only so much sugar addiction that you can develop, I think.
No,
At least I hope so.
That makes sense. I kind of think of the lowest of the low-hanging fruit is sugary drinks. So, that's where I often try to really fight hard with my kids. Like, I go to war on that, and then I sometimes lose the war on other things. But it's just so, even if you try to keep it out of your house, like every time they go to a friend's house, every time they go to a party, it's just sugar everywhere.
Yeah, that's the really bad thing about it. It's just so normalized. It's a part of childhood, and what really annoys me about it is that it's the cheapest, easiest way to do parenting. You can just buy your child's happiness and satisfaction and silence and cooperation by just giving them candy, and it's such a high time preference thing to do because you're trading their future health for your ease of for your peace of mind today. You don't want to go and do an activity with them, you don't want to keep them busy, you don't want to read a book with them, you don't want to talk to them about something interesting. So just give them a piece of candy and they'll leave you alone, and then you can go back to your important things like watching Netflix or whatever.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm ashamed of this, but when my son was little, before I'd figured all this stuff out, I would, he'd like use the potty, whatever, the rewards were M&Ms. It's just how we thought about everything. And, looking back, it's like such bad training.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, it's a massive problem.
Brian here is asking, what are your thoughts on fasting? Do you think fasting helps with insulin resistance?
Yeah, I don't think I've seen quite enough evidence on fasting, but the general principle, seems to make sense to me. And it's certainly, I think that, the most important thing is to get the insulin down. So if you're losing weight, if you're overweight and you're losing weight and fasting and it's working for you, unless it's a really extreme fast in which you need a doctor's supervision, then that's something else. But fasting is working for you and you're losing weight, I think it's, a good thing. And, I think the evidence certainly points in that direction from, animal studies and from short-term studies. So, I've tried in recent years to, cut out breakfast after seeing that. But, if you're keeping your insulin down with a very low carb diet, then it's probably less important. You could probably do one or the other and do well.
Yeah, I'm still not entirely convinced that the benefits will be significant if you're not getting insulin spikes from sugary food. Jury's still out as far as I'm concerned. I think there might well be a case that you're better off just eating more meat and making sure that you get nutrition from meat, because once you switch to an all meat diet, the entire idea of eating being bad for you and eating making you sick and eating making you fat goes away. Eating is nutrition, it's nourishment. You're building your body by putting the food that you need in it. So it's not as compelling an idea to try to quit the food that is not harmful.
Yeah, and you'll find, if you're eating a big meal, of red meat, as you've said, you'll fast naturally the next day because you'll just feel so full.
Yeah, exactly. I always tell people, if you're hungry less than 12 hours after you ate, then you didn't eat enough meat. Thank you so much, Sam, for joining us. This has been extremely interesting and fascinating. Your book is a wonderful book, and I highly recommend people pick it up. And please keep pounding this drum. It may seem lonely at some points, but I promise you a lot of us are paying attention, and I promise you a lot of Bitcoiners are going to be interested in this, and one day, who knows, maybe Bitcoin will fix this.
All right, well, thank you so much for having me on. I really appreciate it.
Thanks. Have a good day.
Okay, take care.
You too. Bye.